Ah, wonderful. All right, everyone. Stop what you're doing, put down your chores, and get ready for another story from your favorite accidental historian. I know, the excitement is palpable. Sit down, or preferably lie down somewhere very comfortable, because the chance of you having to roll with laughter, or boredom, is high. Dim the lights, take a deep breath, and get ready to witness the newest terrible decision of a whiny nerd. I mean, an incredible adventure. Yeah, that's it. An adventure. You know that moment when you realize you should have learned to say no? Or maybe developed a less problematic hobby? Like, I don't know, collecting stamps. Or bird watching. Anything that didn't involve a grimoire bound in suspicious leather with a scent that oscillates between vanilla and an ancient curse. Yeah. There I was, once again, going down the stairs of my grandma's basement, the same space with a controlled temperature of around 45 degrees Celsius, smelling of mold and despair, and poor lighting courtesy of my grandpa's old flashlight that looks more like an archaeological artifact than a useful piece of equipment. I swear that flashlight's battery is the same one from the last time Halley's Comet passed by. Its light is more a concept, a suggestion of clarity, than actual illumination. The book? Of course, it was there. Waiting for me. With the same smug look as a cat who just knocked something off a shelf and knows there's nothing you can do about it. Temps Deviationum, the unauthorized manual of the worst temporal decisions of my life. I should have thrown this thing in a volcano. Or, more realistically, a municipal incinerator. But my laziness, as always, is a force of nature much more powerful than my ability to make good decisions. And as always, because I am, apparently, a magnet for historical problems, because curiosity always wins the battle against common sense, because I am, me. I open the book. The ancient pages, dry as the bones of a forgotten philosopher, made that classic B-movie adventure sound, and there it was, another spell, another trip, another chance to screw myself over in an era without basic sanitation. I read it. Out loud, of course. Because who needs judgment when you have a holy sweatshirt, braces that collect more residue than a vacuum cleaner, and a brain that ignores all the painful lessons from previous trips? The temptation was too great. Egypt. The land of pharaohs, pyramids, and animal-headed gods. For a history addict like me, it was the equivalent of offering a feast of sweets to a diabetic. I knew I was going to feel sick, but the taste, oh, the taste. In tempus Egyptiacum, ubi sol regnat et nihilus vitam dat. The words came out of my mouth with a frightening ease. I didn't even have to try. It was as if the book wanted to be read. I felt the basement air grow heavy, dense. That smell of mold was replaced by something different. Something ancient. The smell of hot sand, of spices I couldn't name, and ozone? Maybe. The classic vortex began. That sensation of being sucked down a cosmic drain. The sound of a laughing goat, yes. He's back. The interdimensional Caprine seems to be a fan of my suffering. And then... whump! A soft landing. As soft as falling face first into a sand dune. The first thing I noticed wasn't the scenery. It was the sensation. A heat. but not the humid, stuffy heat of my grandma's basement. It was a dry, oppressive heat, as if someone had opened the door to a giant oven and I was standing right in front of it. The sun was a physical entity, a weight on my shoulders, a divine spotlight that seemed determined to find and incinerate every pale, freckled cell in my body. I opened my eyes, blinking. The light was blinding. Everything was yellow. An endless sea of yellow, ochre, and golden tones. Sand. So much sand. And the first thing that happened, obviously, was a microscopic grain of quartz finding the exact path to lodge itself between my canine tooth and my brace's bracket. Perfect. Simply perfect. A new era, the same orthodontic suffering. Sand gets into places modern engineering never dreamed of. I sat up, spitting a mouthful of desert from my mouth. I was on the slope of a low, rocky hill. Below me, a strip of vibrant green and deep blue cut through the arid landscape like a painting. The Nile. It wasn't just a river, it was a life force, pulsing under the merciless sun. And on the other bank, my jaw dropped, despite the metallic discomfort in my mouth. Temples. Colossi. Structures so immense that my 21st century brain took a second to process that they weren't a special effect. I could make out, even from a distance, the grandeur of Karnak, the outlines of what would be the Temple of Luxor. I wasn't just in ancient Egypt. I was in Thebes, the city of Ammonius, the capital of the new kingdom. And from the style of the architecture and the clothing of the few people I could see in the distance, I'd venture a guess. Dynasty XX. Around 1100 something BC. The Ramesside era. The twilight of a golden age. A sigh escaped my lips. Not of admiration. Of exhaustion. Great, I muttered to no one. Another UNESCO World Heritage Site before it was cool. And, more importantly, before the concept of air conditioning and sunscreen. My sweatshirt, which was already a terrible choice for my neighborhood summer, was now an instrument of torture. Sweat began to run down my forehead, mixing with the dust. The smell in the air was a complex mix. It had the smell of dry dust, the slightly sweet scent of the river, the odor of donkey manure somewhere nearby, the smell of sweaty bodies working under the sun, and a floral aroma coming from some hardy shrubs growing among the rocks. It was the smell of living history, and, honestly, living history smelled like hard work and a lack of deodorant. My plan? Brilliant, as always. Find some shade and hope the book magically reappeared to get me out of there. Or, in the worst-case scenario, wait for death by dehydration, which, at that moment, didn't seem like such a bad option. I started to descend the hill, my rubber-soled sneakers completely unsuitable for the terrain. Each step kicked up a small cloud of dust. In the distance, I heard sounds. The bleating of goats, the distant shout of a man guiding his oxen, and a rhythmic thump, 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 accompanied by a chorus of voices. Curiosity, that old enemy of mine, made me turn toward the sound. I rounded the base of the hill and saw the source of the noise. A group of men, with suntanned skin and wearing only white linen kilts, worked on a series of adobe structures. They were simple, rectangular houses, clustered together. It looked like a village. And not just any village. By its location, nestled at the foot of the Theban hills, a reasonable walk from what I knew to be the Valley of the Kings, it could only be one place. Satmater Imandi weighs it. The place of truth on the west of Thebes. Today, we know it by an Arabic name, Deir el-Medina. The village of artisans. The men who built and decorated the tombs of the pharaohs. The most skilled and, supposedly, best paid workers in Egypt. And there they were. Sculptors, painters, masons. Living and working under that relentless sun. I approached, trying to be as inconspicuous as possible, which is difficult when you're a 6-foot-tall redhead wearing a gray sweatshirt with a rock band logo that wouldn't exist for 3,000 years and have braces that glisten in the sun. I hid behind a pile of mud bricks that were drying next to one of the houses. The rhythmic sound came from a group using wooden mallets to break stones. Others mixed mud and straw with their feet. A scribe, sitting cross-legged in the shade of a small awning, wrote something on a limestone plaque, an ostrakhan. The scene was incredibly normal. Mundane. Small children, naked and with the side locks of childhood, ran between the houses, laughing and kicking a ball made of rags. Women talked as they ground grains on grinding stones. It was everyday life happening, a snapshot of a world I had only seen in books and museums. And then, I saw something that made me smile with irony. A foreman, a slightly stockier man with a better quality kilt, walked down a line of workers who had finished a task. He didn't hand them coins. There were no coins. He gave each of them a few round, flat loaves of bread and, most importantly, a ceramic jar. From the jar, he poured a thick, bubbly liquid into a cup the worker held. Beer. That was it. The famous Egyptian salary. Bread and beer. The basis of the economy. The source of calories, nutrition, the safe drink in a world where water could be dangerous. Their beer, I knew, was more of a nutritious porridge than the drink we know. It was rich in vitamins, proteins, and, of course, enough alcohol to make the day a little less arid. One of the workers, a thin man with broad shoulders, drank his beer ration in one gulp, his head thrown back. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and said something to the colleague next to him. I didn't understand the words. Of course, ancient Egyptian isn't part of my high school curriculum, but the tone was universal. It was a tone of tiredness, of momentary satisfaction, but with a hint of complaint. I watched the foreman continue the distribution. He seemed to be counting the loaves with extra care. The beer jars didn't seem to be completely full. I remembered the sub-themes the book had shown me before the trip. The first strike. The bread and the beer. It was all here. I wasn't just an accidental temporal tourist, I was a witness. A sweaty, uncomfortable witness with sand in his teeth, but a witness nonetheless. I leaned against the adobe wall, the heat seeping through my faded sweatshirt. The sun moved slowly across the sky, a cosmic clock indifferent to my little existential crisis. The voices around me formed a strange melody, a constant hum of a life that pulsed at a completely different rhythm from mine. I heard a closer murmur. Two men, hidden from the sun on the other side of my pile of bricks. This month's grain came late again, one of them said in a low, hoarse voice. What about the oil? The other replied. My wife says the lamps are almost dry. How am I supposed to work in the tombs in the dark? With the light of my own virtue? The first one let out a short, bitter laugh. Your virtue wouldn't even light up a sarcophagus, Keba. They didn't know it, but they were planting the seeds of something big. A seed of discontent that would soon sprout under the Egyptian sun. And I was there to see it. My plan to find some shade and wither in peace was officially ruined by my own nerdy curiosity. I decided to stay. To observe. After all, when else would I have the chance to see the history of labor rights being written, not with ink, but with sweat, thirst, and frustration? Maybe this trip wasn't a complete disaster. Although, on second thought, I was still wearing a sweatshirt in the middle of the Egyptian desert. No. It was definitely still a disaster. A disaster with academic value. The best kind of disaster. Staying there, crouched behind a pile of mud bricks that radiated the day's heat like a poorly regulated space heater, gave me time to reflect. My life was, essentially, a series of bad decisions driven by curiosity. And there I was, at the peak of my career as a terrible decision maker, watching the live prequel to all the union protests in history. It was missing the banners, the megaphones, and the union vests, but the essence was all there, empty bellies and short patience. The sun, that celestial tyrant, finally began to show some mercy. It plunged slowly behind the rocky hills to the west, painting the sky with colors no computer screen could replicate. Shades of orange, pink, and a deep purple spread across the horizon, and the shadows stretched, bringing an almost sinful relief from the heat. The air became more breathable. The people of the village, the artisans of Set Mot, began to change their pace. The heavy tools were put away. The rhythmic sound of mallets and chisels gave way to the murmur of conversations, the crying of babies, and the smell of firewood smoke and bread baking in clay ovens. It was the end of the workday. Families gathered. I saw men bending down to pick up their children, women bringing fresh water jars from the community well. For a moment, the scene was almost idyllic. A Bronze Age margarine commercial. But the tension, like the heat emanating from the ground, was still there, just beneath the surface. I couldn't stay behind that pile of bricks forever. My curiosity and my aching back wouldn't allow it. With the light fading, I had a better chance of moving without looking like, well, a clumsy, red-haired time traveler. I decided the best thing to do was to look like I belonged, which was a monumental challenge. My plan was simple: walk slowly, avoid eye contact, and try not to trip over my own feet. A strategy, by the way, I was already successfully using in high school hallways. I started walking through the village's narrow alleys. The houses were glued to each other, made of adobe with flat roofs of palm fronds and mud. The doors were open to let the air circulate. I could see inside some of them, 1 or 2 simple rooms, with reed mats on the floor, some ceramic pots leaning against the walls, and a small domestic altar with statuettes of gods like Bes, the protector of the home, and Tauret, the hippopotamus goddess of fertility. It was intimate. It was real. And I felt like a complete intruder. The conversations I heard, though mostly incomprehensible to me, had a clear common thread: frustration. I didn't need to be a fluent Egyptologist to understand the body language. Hands gesturing towards a half-empty bag of grain. A man's shrug when his wife pointed to a pot of oil. I saw the same foreman from before, the bread and beer distributor, being confronted by a small group of workers. He wasn't yelling. He seemed as tired as they were. He just spread his hands, in a universal gesture of "there's nothing I can do." Bureaucracy, it seems, was a paralyzing force long before the invention of 3-part forms. The problem was bigger than just a delay. It was a breach of Ma'at, the cosmic order, justice, balance. The Pharaoh was the guarantor of Ma'at on earth. He fed his people, and in return, his people built his house for eternity. But the system was failing. The rations, which came from the granaries of the great temples, weren't arriving. And without rations, there was no work. Without work, there was no tomb. And without a tomb, well, that was a serious problem for a god-king's afterlife. The classic outsourcing of essential services gone wrong, I thought to myself, finding a dark corner near an external staircase that led to the roof of a house. The central government promises, the temple storeroom doesn't deliver, and the factory floor workers pay the price. Some things really never change. While I was there, immersed in my sarcastic socioeconomic observations, a small commotion caught my attention. It came from a house a few meters away from me. A woman came out crying, her words a fast, sharp lament. Soon, an older man, with a gray beard and an air of quiet authority, was called and entered the house. Curious, I approached, using the growing darkness as my disguise. Through the open door, I saw the scene. A child, a boy perhaps 6 or 7 years old, was lying on a mat, trembling under a linen sheet. His breathing was fast and shallow, and his mother was trying to place a damp cloth on his forehead. The older man, the SWNW, the doctor, knelt beside the boy. I expected a show of superstition. Feathers, rattles, amulets being waved frantically. And, to be fair, there was a bit of that. The doctor murmured some words, probably an invocation to Sekhmet, the goddess of healing, or Heka, the god of magic himself. But what he did next surprised me. With impressive delicacy, he placed his fingers on the boy's pulse. Then, on his neck. He was checking his pulse. He pulled back the sheet and gently pressed the child's abdomen, observing his reaction. He leaned in and smelled the boy's breath. He was performing a physical exam. A diagnosis. My nerd brain went into a frenzy. That wasn't just sorcery. It was empirical science in its infancy. I knew exactly what this was about. The knowledge that man was displaying was codified in one of the most incredible documents in human history, the Ebers Papyrus. A 20-meter-long scroll, written centuries before my arrival, but whose knowledge was still the basis of medical practice. I stood there, fascinated. I knew what that papyrus contained. More than 700 remedies and magical formulas. Precise descriptions of diseases. There were sections on the heart, which they correctly identified as the center of the circulatory system, with vessels going to all limbs. They described tumors, offering cauterization as a treatment. They had recipes for digestive problems, skin diseases, dental problems. And, what was most impressive, they had a section on mental disorders, like depression, which they poetically and with shocking precision called affliction of the heart or grieving heart. The doctor got up and spoke calmly to the mother. He took a small leather pouch and pulled out some dried herbs in a small vial with a dark liquid. He gave instructions, probably to prepare a tea or a paste. The mother nodded, the panic in her eyes giving way to a glimmer of hope. The irony of the situation was overwhelming. Here was a society with medical knowledge capable of identifying diseases and proposing rational treatments, a system that understood the human body in a way that Europe would only achieve more than 2,000 years later. And, at the same time, this same society, with its divine command structure and colossal bureaucracy, could not perform the basic logistical task of moving grain from a warehouse to a village a few kilometers away. They could diagnose a heart problem, but they couldn't solve a supply chain problem. The scene gave me a different perspective. These weren't just angry workers. They were fathers, husbands, sons. The lack of food wasn't a political abstraction. It meant that their child, lying with a fever, wouldn't have the proper nutrition to recover. The lack of oil wasn't a mere inconvenience. It meant darkness, inability to work, and consequently, more hunger. The strike that was forming wasn't for luxury. It was for survival. I decided I needed to find a place to spend the night. Wandering the alleys was a recipe for being discovered and, probably, mistaken for a desert spirit or, worse, a tomb raider. I saw the external staircase near where I was. It led to the flat roof. With one last look to make sure no one was watching, I climbed the time-worn stone steps. The roof was an oasis of tranquility. The night breeze was cool, almost cold. The sky, oh, the sky. Without the light pollution of my century, the universe displayed its full glory. Millions of stars, constellations I barely recognized because they were so clear, and the milky band of the Milky Way cutting across the sky from end to end. I lay down on the dry, hard mud, using my sweatshirt now as a makeshift pillow. Below, village life continued, a constant murmur. Up here, there was only the silence of the desert and the spectacle of the cosmos. A hotel room with a view of billions of stars. And for free. Maybe there was an upside to all this, after all. But the comfort was fleeting. I knew the morning would bring back the sun, the hunger, and the growing anger of the men who slept under that same sky. And I would be there to see it. My personal suffering seemed insignificant in the face of the collective drama that was about to explode. At least, that's what I told myself to avoid panicking. The first thing I learned about sleeping on a desert roof is that the universe doesn't have a snooze button. The sun doesn't rise, it explodes. In one instant, I was in a cold, dark vacuum, speckled with diamonds. The next instant, the edge of the world caught fire, and a lance of golden light hit me squarely in the eyes. The end of my beauty sleep. If you can call sleep the act of spending 8 hours alternating between the cutting cold of the early morning and the paranoia of rolling off a 10-foot drop. I sat up, cracking my back. The morning air was deceptively fresh and clean, with that smell of dust and cold stone. Down below, in Set Mott, the village of artisans, the routine was starting again. The sound of ceramic pots, sleepy voices, the crying of a child. But there was something different. A quietness where there should have been the noise of work. The chisels were silent. The mallets, still. It was a tense quietness, the kind of silence that precedes an important decision. From my privileged viewpoint on the roof, I had a panoramic view. The men were not heading to the workshops or the path that led to the Valley of the Kings. Instead, they were gathering in the central square of the village, an open space near the well. There were no shouts, no chaos. Just a congregation. One by one, they came out of their houses, faces marked by sleep, but with a hard determination in their eyes. They talked in small groups, their voices low but firm. The catalyst, as I suspected, was the absence. The morning ration pots were empty. The bread didn't come. The beer didn't come. The cosmic order, the Ma'at, hadn't just been shaken, it had taken the day off. And with it, the workers' patience. I saw a man, who seemed to be one of the leaders, maybe one of the team's scribes himself, like the famous Ammanact, whose records documented all this, climb onto a stone to speak to the others. I didn't understand the words, but the message was clear. He pointed in the direction of the great temples on the plain, then to their own mouths, then to the houses where their families were. It was a speech that needed no translation. Our families are hungry. Our work builds eternity for the Pharaoh, but we cannot fill our bellies today. If the bread doesn't come to us, we will go to the bread. And then, the decision was made. They were going to march. To leave their isolated village and take their complaint directly to the mortuary temples, the administrative centers that managed their rations. It was a bold move. They weren't just skipping work, they were abandoning their posts and defying the authority of the supervisors and priests. My policy of temporal non-intervention, which I had created about 5 minutes earlier, was immediately put to the test. I could stay there, safe in the empty village, and maybe look for leftover food. Or I could follow the first recorded strike in history. See firsthand the moment when ordinary workers realized their labor was a weapon. Ah, to hell with safety, I muttered to a pigeon that looked at me with disdain from the neighboring roof. The chance to see the world premiere of the class struggle, the musical, is too good to miss. I went down the staircase with an agility that surprised me. I waited for the procession of men to start moving and join the press, which is to say, myself, keeping a safe distance of about 50 meters. I was the unwanted international correspondent covering the event. The march began. About 60 men, maybe more. The elite of Egypt's artisans, on strike. And as they walked, a chant started. It wasn't a complex song. It was a visceral, rhythmic shout that echoed off the cliffs. And I, with my knowledge from books and documentaries, recognized the phonetics. They were shouting, "Okna hiku." We are hungry. Hearing that, it wasn't like reading it on a page. It was a sound wave that hit you in the chest. The simplicity was brutal. It wasn't a complex political manifesto. It was the most fundamental truth of human existence. We are hungry. Two words that have brought down empires. As we walked, yes, we walked, because I already felt like a part of it, the parasitic observer, I noticed the role of the women. They didn't march with the men, which was probably a strategic decision to protect the families and the village. But they were there. They stood at the doors of their houses, watching their husbands, fathers, and sons leave. Some handed out small leather pouches with water. Their faces didn't show fear, but a fierce solidarity. They were the rear guard, the reason the march was happening. They were as much a part of that strike as the men who were shouting. The path was dusty and the sun was already starting to punish. I was glad my sweatshirt had become a makeshift turban to protect my head. Officially participating in the first march in history, I thought, feeling a blister forming on my heel. My feet are already entering a motion of repudiation against my sneakers, and the sun is picketing my dignity. They didn't head to the Valley of the Kings, their workplace. The target was different. They marched toward the Ramesseum, the mortuary temple of Ramses II. Although the reigning pharaoh was Ramses III, the older temples still functioned as administrative centers and granaries. That's where the bureaucrats were. The scribes. The priests. The people with the keys to the bread. The walk lasted almost an hour. An hour of dust, sun, and the constant chant, "We are hungry." Finally, we arrived. The Ramesseum was colossal, even in its already ancient state for the time. Giant statues, immense courtyards, walls covered with hieroglyphs proclaiming eternal victories. And in front of all this glory, a group of hungry and angry artisans stopped. The temple guards, armed with spears and leather shields, formed a hesitant line. They didn't seem to want to fight. They seemed confused. They had probably never seen anything like it. Soon, some scribes came out, unrolling papyri with an air of importance. The confrontation began. I found a new vantage point, behind the remains of a fallen statue. The workers did not try to force their way in. They sat on the ground. An occupation. A sit-in. They simply refused to leave until someone listened to them. Their leader, the same man who spoke in the village, argued with a scribe who seemed increasingly frustrated. The scribe pointed to his papyrus, probably quoting rules, regulations, procedures. The workers' leader simply pointed to his companions' mouths. Papyrus versus hunger. An ancient battle. I was witnessing a calculated and brilliant act of civil disobedience. They were not an irrational mob. They were strategists. They knew that violence would condemn them. But their peaceful presence was a living accusation against the inefficiency of the state. They were using their visibility to shame the authorities and force them to act. The stalemate stretched on. The sun climbed to its peak, making the stone floor unbearably hot. Scribes came and went. No solution appeared. The only thing the workers received were promises. "We'll come back tomorrow," seemed to be the consensus of the bureaucrats. But the workers did not move. Hunger gave them a stubborn patience. I was fascinated. And also very thirsty. The irony of me, a well-fed tourist from the future, being there observing a strike for food was not lost on me. I felt a pang of guilt, which I quickly masked with more sarcasm. Excellent customer service, I thought. The temple's ombudsman seems to have the system down. Maybe they should try rebooting the pharaoh. There is a special kind of silence that only happens under a scorching sun when a group of people is engaged in a battle of wills. It's not an empty silence. It's a heavy silence, full of unspoken things. It was in that silence that I was marinated, crouched behind my broken statue, which by this time of day was hot enough to bake a loaf of bread. If only I had the dough. The stalemate at the Ramesseum gate was a spectacle of inertia. On one side, the artisans, motionless, turning their hunger into a passive weapon. Their bodies sitting on the ground were a more effective barrier than any barricade. On the other side, the scribes and temple officials, who went in and out of the gate like nervous ants whose anthill had been poked. The negotiations were a masterpiece of procrastination. A scribe would come out, unroll a papyrus with a solemn air, and read a proclamation full of honorary titles for the pharaoh, life, prosperity, health, and vague promises. "Your loyalty has been noted," he would say, or something to that effect. "The granaries of Thebes are being audited. A caravan of grain has already left Memphis and should arrive, eventually. It was the Egyptian equivalent of your call is very important to us. Please continue to hold." And the workers, to their credit, weren't buying it. With each empty promise, their leader would simply stand up, point to the men, and repeat the same powerful phrase, "We are hungry." It was the final argument, the checkmate against which bureaucracy had no defense. I watched, fascinated. These men, who spent their lives carving perfection into stone, applying paint with single bristle brushes, were now applying the same precision and patience to their own rebellion. No excesses. Just constant, unwavering pressure. Finally, as the sun began to descend from its peak and the shadow of the great temple pylon began to stretch, the wall of bureaucracy cracked. The public embarrassment must have become unbearable. A high-ranking official, dressed in the finest pleated linen, came out and gave an order. Some temple servants emerged, not with sacks of grain, but with trays of bread. Sweet loaves, in fact, made with honey and dates. The kind of offering that usually went to the gods or the priests. It wasn't their payment. It wasn't the full ration. It was a bribe. A gesture to say, "Take this and go, you're ruining the view." The workers' leader consulted with his men. There was a murmur. They knew it was a bribe, a partial and imperfect victory. But it was food. They accepted. Each man received 1 or 2 loaves. Their dignity might be bruised, but their stomachs would have temporary relief. With a final statement that they would return if the full rations were not delivered, they rose in unison and began the long walk back to the village. Victory, round 1. I followed them, a hungry ghost in their wake. The atmosphere on the walk back was different. The hard anger of the morning had been replaced by something more complex. An exhaustion mixed with a glint of triumph. They had stood up to the system, and the system had blinked first. They laughed, talked, and shared pieces of their sweet bread. They had rediscovered their power. As we passed through a greener stretch near the cultivated area, I saw a scene that took me back to the night before. Near a small house, the boy who had been sick was now sitting outside in the shade, nibbling on a piece of figure. His mother watched him with a look that was the universal definition of relief. The fever seemed to have gone down. The intervention of the SWNW, the doctor, with his herbs and his empirical knowledge, had worked. And the irony hit me again, with more force. The village could heal their own sick. They had the knowledge, the resilience, the community. But for the most basic thing of all, their daily bread, they depended on an external, distant, and flawed structure. They were masters of their craft, guardians of a precious medical knowledge, but they were hostages of a distribution system. That night, the atmosphere in Deir el-Medina was electric. The fire of the bonfires seemed brighter. The voices, louder. The sweet bread was shared among the families. It wasn't much, but it was a victory to savor. The discussions now were about strategy. Tomorrow, we demand the oil. And the fish? We will not go back to work until the warehouses are open to us. The strike wasn't over, it was just the first act. And I was truly hungry now. The sweet bread they ate had awakened my own stomach. My historical adventure was losing its academic luster and becoming a very real exercise in survival. My 21st century body, accustomed to 3 meals a day and intermediate snacks, was entering protest mode. With the village occupied in its strategic meetings, I decided it was time to think about my own crisis. The book, Temps Deviationum. It had to be somewhere. It never completely abandoned me. It was more like an irresponsible father who drops you off at a party and promises to come back and pick you up later. I started to look. Discreetly. I checked the spot where I landed. Nothing. I walked through the alleys, looking into the dark corners, the dead ends. My gaze fell on one of the artisans' workshops, now silent and dark. The door was ajar. An opportunity. I went in. The smell of stone dust, mineral pigments, and dry wood filled my nostrils. Tools were scattered on the benches, as if they had been dropped in the middle of a sentence. Bronze chisels, wooden mallets, pots of powdered paint, ochre, malachite, azurite. There was an unfinished limestone bust of some nobleman, its half-formed face seeming to judge me in silence. It was a sanctuary of work, momentarily abandoned. And there, in a dark corner, behind some rolls of blank papyrus, I saw it. The familiar leather spine. The book. It was there, quiet, waiting. I felt a wave of relief so intense my legs gave way. My way back. But I didn't pick it up. Not yet. Outside, I heard the voices of the workers, planning the next day. History was still happening. My curiosity, that most dominant and destructive of my traits, fought against my instinct for self-preservation. Go home, to a hot shower and a cheese sandwich? Or stay and see how the biggest labor dispute of the Bronze Age would end? The decision, unfortunately, was too obvious for a nerd like me. The cheese sandwich could wait. There's a fundamental difference between knowing you have a way back and actually using it. It's the difference between having an eject button and actually pulling the lever. There, in the dusty silence of that workshop, the Temps Deviationum seemed less like a mystical artifact and more like an accusation. It offered me a way out, an escape to the familiar comfort of my own time, with its processed foods, its Wi-Fi, and, most importantly, its total absence of sand in my teeth. And I, the biggest idiot to ever break the time barrier, decided to ignore it. My FOMO, fear of missing out, was, it seems, a condition that transcended eras. I couldn't leave before I saw the end of the play. I spent the night there, huddled in a corner of the workshop. Sleeping was impossible. My stomach rumbled in protest, a pathetic duet with the desert crickets. My mind, however, was on fire. I went over the day's events, the march, the cry of "We are hungry," the small, humiliating victory of the sweet bread. Those men weren't just pawns in history, they were the protagonists. And their script wasn't over yet. The next morning was born with the same ruthless punctuality as the last, but the village of el-Medina woke up differently. The energy was not one of despair, but of determination. The partial victory of the day before, however small, had been a tonic. They had proven to themselves that their voice, when united, could shake the walls of the temples. Today, they wouldn't ask. They would demand. I positioned myself early, finding a new vantage point on top of a hill that gave me a view of both the village and the path leading to the plain. Their strategy had changed. The march started earlier. And this time, they didn't go to the Ramesseum. The target was more audacious, more direct. They marched to Medinet Habu, the great mortuary temple of the reigning pharaoh, Ramses III. It was the equivalent of taking the protest not to a regional secretary, but to the door of the presidential palace. The group was larger. Some of the older men, who had stayed behind the day before, joined the march. Their steps were faster, their faces harder. The chant of "We are hungry" returned, but now it had a tone of ultimatum, not supplication. I followed them, my heart beating in a mix of fear and excitement. I was getting good at being an anonymous shadow. Upon arriving at Medinet Habu, with its immense pylons carved with scenes of Ramses III crushing his enemies, the scene from the day before was repeated, but with 10 times the intensity. The temple guards seemed more nervous. The scribes, more irritated. The empty promises were tried again and were rejected with disdain. And then, it happened. The turning point. Led by Amenact, the scribe who had become famous for documenting these events, the workers didn't sit outside. With a coordinated movement, they walked past the astonished guards and entered the temple's first courtyard. There was no violence. There was no looting. It was an act of peaceful invasion, an occupation of the sacred space of power. They had crossed a line. And that's when my brilliant plan of distant observation failed spectacularly. In the confusion of the advancing crowd, and in my attempt to get a better angle, I tripped on a loose stone and rolled down the hill, landing right in the middle of a group of workers who made up the rear guard. I fell so clumsily that one of them had to hold me to keep me from hitting the ground face first. Suddenly, dozens of eyes turned to me. The stranger. The pale, red-haired ghost in bizarre clothes and metal on his teeth. Silence fell over our small group. Time froze. A man, with a face wrinkled by sun and dust, looked me up and down. His expression was a mix of suspicion and perplexity. He said something, a question. I just shook my head, my eyes wide, trying to look as harmless as possible. My mind was screaming, say something. Use your knowledge of Egyptology. But my mouth could only produce a pathetic sound, something like air. To my eternal luck, at that exact moment, a temple official shouted an order from the top of the wall, and everyone's attention turned to him. The crisis was averted. I was forgotten, absorbed by the crowd. But now I was inside. I was no longer an observer, I was part of the statistic. An anachronistic redhead trapped inside an Egyptian temple in the middle of a workers' revolt. Perfect. On my resume, I could now add participation in a historical riot, non-voluntary. I'm sure that would earn me some points on my report card. The tension inside the courtyard was palpable. We were surrounded by the glory of the empire, massive columns, colorful reliefs of gods and pharaohs, but the air was filled with the raw reality of hunger. The workers spread out, occupying the space, their simple and sweaty presences a stark contrast to the grandeur of the stone. The negotiations became frantic. Scribes ran back and forth. This time, they knew promises wouldn't be enough. The occupation of the temple was a sacrilege, a direct insult to the divine order. This had to be resolved. And fast. I cowered near a gigantic column, trying to merge with the hieroglyphs. From there, I could hear the arguments. el-Medina, the leader, spoke with impressive clarity and logic. He wasn't yelling. He was listing the facts. 18 days late last month. The fish rations haven't been seen in 2 moons. The oil provided is rancid and insufficient. He wasn't appealing to pity, he was making a case for breach of contract. He had records. He had the dates. He was, essentially, conducting a live audit, in front of everyone. Finally, the vizier of Thebes himself was summoned. A powerful man, the second most important figure after the pharaoh in the region. His arrival was the sign that the workers had won. The final discussion was almost a formality. The vizier, confronted with el-Medina's irrefutable logic in the stubborn presence of dozens of men in his temple, conceded. A scribe was called, a new papyrus was unrolled, and an agreement was formally drafted. The scene was surreal. There, under the Egyptian sun, the first collective bargaining in history was being documented. The papyrus specified that all delayed rations would be paid immediately, and it established a clear schedule for future deliveries, with direct supervision from a vizier's official. When the final word was written and the vizier's seal was pressed onto the document, a murmur ran through the crowd, which then erupted in a cry of triumph. It wasn't a shout of anger, but of cathartic relief. They had won. Against all odds, against the most formidable power structure of the ancient world, a group of hungry artisans had asserted their rights. The withdrawal from the temple was orderly, but triumphant. And when we reached the plain, we saw the reason for the authorities' final capitulation. A long line of donkeys, loaded with sacks of grain and jars of oil, was already on its way to Deir el-Medina. The sight of that caravan of sustenance was more powerful than any speech. I separated myself from the celebrating crowd, my heart still racing with the adrenaline of almost being discovered. I walked back to the village, which was now buzzing with a completely different energy. Women and children ran to meet the men, and the news of the victory spread like wildfire. The distribution of the rations was a scene I will never forget. Sacks of emmer and barley grain, the basis for bread and beer. Jars of sesame oil for the lamps. Dried fish, vegetables, dates. It was the nation's economy being delivered into the hands of its people. I saw the village doctor, the SWNW, receiving his portion, not as a privileged worker, but as a member of the community, whose ability to heal depended as much on his herbs as on the strength his patients drew from the food. Everything was connected. Health, work, bread, justice. Ma'at. They hadn't broken it, they had restored it. Night fell on a celebrating village. The smell was no longer of dust and frustration, but of baking bread, grilling fish, of joy. Laughter echoed through the alleys where before only murmurs of complaint were heard. They had earned that. Not by favor, but by right. For me, the spectacle was over. My curiosity was satisfied. I had seen history, not as a dusty narrative, but as a vibrant and real human drama. It was time to go home. I slipped through the shadows of the celebration and returned to the silent workshop. There it was, my loyal and problematic book, waiting patiently in the gloom. I picked it up. The leather felt warm to the touch, or maybe it was just my imagination. I took one last look through the workshop door. I saw the silhouette of a family gathered around a fire, the father lifting his son onto his shoulders. I saw the light of the freshly refilled oil lamps shining in the windows. I saw life. So that's it, I whispered to the book. History isn't just made by pharaohs in golden chariots or by generals conquering empires. It's made by ordinary people, with hunger, with anger, with enough courage to say enough. It's an important lesson. I paused. Now, if you'll excuse me, I really need to get back to an era with less sand and more pepperoni toppings. I opened the book to the page marked by my last spell. The Latin words glowed faintly in the darkness. I took one last deep breath of the Egyptian air, the smell of smoke, bread, and dust, and began to read. Ad domum, ad tempus meum, redire. The world around me began to dissolve. The workshop, the tools, the sounds of the party, everything fell into a blur of light and color. The familiar sensation of being pulled down a cosmic drain took hold of me. And yes, right at the climax of my interdimensional departure, I heard it. The faint but unmistakable sound of a goat laughing somewhere in the ether. That goat really needed a better hobby. And then... whump! Silence. Darkness. The smell of mold, ancient dust, and mothballs. The air was cold and damp. I was lying on my back on something hard and uneven. I opened my eyes. Above me, on the ceiling, were spiderwebs as thick as cotton candy. I was back. Back in my grandma's basement. I got up, my whole body aching. I was covered in desert dust, my clothes were in rags, and I was starving. But I was home. The 10th deviationum lay closed on the floor beside me, looking innocent, as if nothing had happened. I climbed the stairs, opened the door, and was greeted by the soft light of the kitchen lamp. The clock on the wall showed that only 10 minutes had passed. 10 minutes in my time. 3 days of dust, hunger, and revolution in the past. I sighed. Another clumsy adventure. Another incredible story to tell. And, most importantly, in the fridge, I knew there was a piece of cold pizza waiting for me. A hero's true reward. Or, in my case, a whiny nerd's. Anyway, that was the story. My glorious and dusty trip to ancient Egypt. I hope it served, at the very least, to help you zone out, to relax. Because I certainly need to. If you enjoyed this show of incompetence and sarcasm, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. It gives me a reason to believe my suffering has a purpose. Turn off the lights, find a comfortable position, and just pass out. Leave the sands of time and the protests for bread and beer to your dreams. I'll see you the next time I'm stupid enough to open that book again. Good night.